I woke up in the hospital with the dry taste of anesthesia still on my tongue and a strange tightness in my chest that had nothing to do with the surgery. My daughter Clarice stood by my bedside, smiling faintly as if she were holding back tears. Or maybe a secret. The lights were soft, the beeping machine steady. And for a moment I thought I had made it through the worst. The nurses had told me I was lucky to survive at my age, and I believed them. I had always been a fighter, always pulled through, even when life tried to knock me down. But nothing could have prepared me for what was waiting on the other side of recovery. Clarice didn't waste time. I hadn't even sat up when she said it, so casually it almost didn't register. "We sold your house, Mom." Just like that. As if it was a spare piece of furniture. Something outdated and no longer useful. I blinked at her, unsure if I'd heard correctly. My house? The home I built with your father? The home where you took your first steps? She nodded, avoiding my gaze, playing with the ends of her scarf like a child caught lying. I felt my throat close. My legs, weak from weeks in bed, twitched under the sheet. I tried to sit up. I needed air. She went on, explaining things I couldn't follow. Something about needing to act quickly, about taxes, about downsizing for my own good. For my own good. Those words rang in my ears like a cruel joke. My body was stitched back together, but something inside me tore in that moment. I didn't cry. Not in front of her. Not yet. I asked her where my things were. She said calmly that they had packed everything. The good china was in storage. My clothes were donated. Donated! She said it like she was proud of herself. Like she had done me a favor. After a few more days of forced rest and robotic meals, the hospital discharged me. Clarice picked me up in her new car, cheerful and overly talkative. She drove me to a place I had never seen before. A cramped little house in the outskirts, with peeling paint and a steep driveway. "We got you a room here." A room, not a home. I stood on the porch, staring at the chipped number on the door, feeling smaller than I had in years. There were other old women inside, some quiet, others muttering to themselves. A caretaker smiled at me like I was another shift on her schedule. Clarice hugged me briefly and said she had errands to run. She drove off before I could say a word. I didn't unpack. There wasn't much to unpack anyway. They had fit my life into 2 boxes, and neither contained the photos I kept by my bedside. I wandered around the house, trying to ignore the faint smell of bleach and old carpet. My roommate, a sweet woman named Nilda, tried to talk to me, but I couldn't find my voice. I didn't belong there. I knew it in my bones. I had a home, or I had one. I laid down on the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling, feeling my chest tighten again. This time it wasn't the surgery. At night I couldn't sleep. Every creak in the walls reminded me of what I had lost. The kitchen light flickered. The radiator hissed. And I lay there, thinking of my garden, of the jasmine bush by the front window, of the smell of my kitchen when I baked bread. Gone. Erased like it had never existed. I wanted to scream, but I swallowed the noise. I didn't want to wake Nilda. She was the only kind face I'd seen all day. Instead, I whispered to the darkness, asking questions no one would answer. The next morning, Clarice returned with groceries and a too bright smile. She spoke loudly like I was deaf, and commented on how much better this place was for me. No stairs, no maintenance, no worries. I looked at her, really looked at her. There was something different in her eyes. Not guilt, no. Relief. She was relieved, as if she had crossed something off her list, as if she had finally gotten rid of a burden. I was her mother, not a broken appliance. I asked her who bought the house. She paused. "Some company," she said. "A cash offer. Fast and easy." "It's gone, Mom. You need to let it go." I didn't reply, but inside something clicked. A quiet, cold clarity began to form. She hadn't done this out of desperation. She had planned it. While I was lying in that hospital bed, trusting her, she had signed away my life. I nodded slowly, pretending to accept, but I was already making a list in my head. Days passed. I settled into the routine, or at least pretended to. I smiled at the caretakers. I folded my clothes. I played along. But every night I wrote in a small notebook I had managed to hide. I wrote down everything I remembered. The date I entered the hospital, the last conversation we had before the surgery, The lawyer's name from when we did the house deed years ago. Clarice thought I was old and confused. That would be her mistake. I began to listen. Old women know things. They notice. I paid attention when Clarice talked on the phone in the hallway, when she whispered things to the staff. She visited less often. Always in a hurry. Always a new excuse. I smiled when she came. I played dumb, but my mind was sharp. I remembered where I had hidden my most important documents. The ones she couldn't find. The ones she didn't even know existed. Nilda noticed I wasn't like the others. One night, she asked me if I was planning something. I looked at her and said, "I'm just thinking." She smiled and nodded. She had that kind of wisdom only age can give. She didn't pry. But from that night on, she started giving me her dessert during dinner, a small act of solidarity. I cherished it more than I expected. One afternoon, I asked the nurse if I could take a walk around the block. She agreed, assuming I'd be too tired to go far. But I walked past the block, past the small grocery store and into the library. I hadn't touched a computer in years, but my fingers remembered enough. I looked up the city property records. I found my address. Sold. Bought by a shell company. But the name attached to the transaction wasn't unfamiliar. It was Clarice's husband. That night, I didn't sleep again. My hands trembled as I gripped the notebook. My daughter had lied. She hadn't sold the house to a stranger. She had orchestrated everything. Maybe for money, maybe for control. But she had done it with my name still on the documents. I wasn't just betrayed. I was robbed. The next morning, I called someone I hadn't spoken to in years. Paolo, my late husband's old friend. A retired lawyer. His voice cracked when he heard mine. He thought I had died. I almost had. I told him everything. Every detail. Every lie. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Come see me. We'll fix this." I told the staff I needed to visit an old friend. They let me go without questions. Nilda squeezed my hand before I left. I packed my notebook in my purse and stepped into the sun. For the first time in weeks, I felt the ground under my feet in a different way. Solid. Real! My steps were slow, but they were mine. I had a truth to reveal. And a home to reclaim. Paolo lived in a modest apartment in an older part of the city, surrounded by books, dusty files, and the scent of worn leather chairs. He hadn't changed much, aside from the deeper lines in his face, and the cane leaning beside his desk. When he opened the door and saw me standing there, he didn't hesitate. He hugged me like family, like someone who had been waiting for the truth to knock. I sat down and handed him the notebook. He didn't speak for a while. He just read, flipping pages slowly, his eyebrows drawing closer with each word. When he finally looked up, there was no sympathy in his eyes, only focus. "You still own it," he said. "If what you wrote here is true, the sale was illegal. She couldn't have done this without a power of attorney, and you never signed one." I nodded. A tightness in my chest I hadn't felt since the surgery. Relief mixed with something darker. Rage, maybe? Betrayal that thickened my blood. He stood and began pulling old files, asking me dates, names, anything I remembered. My memory was clearer than I had expected. Pain has a way of sharpening you. For the next 3 hours, we worked like two people chasing ghosts. We found the original deed, still in my name. We found that no transfer was recorded properly. Paolo shook his head as he read through it all. She used her husband's company to hide the transaction. Smart, but not smart enough. He showed me a copy of a court form. If I signed it, we could challenge the sale and freeze the property. I hesitated for only a moment before scribbling my name at the bottom. My hands shook, but not from fear. After leaving Paolo's office, I took a cab back to the care home. The sun was starting to set, painting everything in orange and gold. I stared out the window, thinking of the jasmine bush that used to bloom near my kitchen window. I imagined it gone now, uprooted or trimmed by strangers. I had let them take so much already, but not anymore. That night I slept, really slept, and in the morning I woke with a plan. Clarice came the next day, cheerful and oblivious. She brought store-bought muffins and asked if I needed anything. I smiled and thanked her. I told her I was feeling stronger, thinking of joining a book club. She smiled back, pleased that I was finally acting like the docile, quiet version of me she wanted. But I watched her closely. I watched how she never asked about my feelings, my pain, or the surgery. Everything was always about logistics, schedules, her time, her needs. I asked her about the house gently, like I was just reminiscing. She kept it vague. Just said it was already being renovated. I nodded and told her how proud I was of her. I think that startled her a little. She didn't expect kindness, but I was already several steps ahead. The less she suspected, the better. That evening, I called Paolo. He had already filed the papers. The court date was set for 2 weeks later. In the days that followed, I began preparing. I talked to Nilda more, shared my story with her piece by piece. She became my confidant. Her presence gave me strength, reminding me I wasn't alone. She told me about her own children, how they had stopped calling, how she lived in the echoes of their promises. We were two ghosts clinging to memory, but we still had fire left. I told her I would win this, not just for me, but for both of us. For all of us who had been discarded too soon. At night, I practiced my testimony. In the mirror, to the walls. I rehearsed how I would tell the judge about the betrayal, the deception, the theft masked as concern. I wouldn't cry. Not this time. I needed my voice steady, clear. I wanted my daughter to hear every word and feel the weight of them. She thought I was too old, too weak, too grateful to fight back. But she had forgotten one thing. I built that house, brick by brick, dream by dream. On the morning of the hearing, I dressed in my best blouse and the pearl earrings my husband gave me on our last anniversary. Nilda hugged me before I left. "You make them listen," she said. I promised her I would. Paolo picked me up himself, opened the car door like I was royalty. At the courthouse, people glanced at me with pity. But that was fine. Let them underestimate me. Let them think I was fragile. I was used to that. It gave me power. We sat in a small courtroom, the walls lined with dull wood and tired expressions. Clarice was there, sitting with her husband, both of them looking too confident. She didn't meet my eyes at first. When she finally did, her smile faltered. I could see the confusion. She hadn't expected me to fight. She thought I'd sit quietly in that care home until the end. She thought the surgery had broken me, but she had no idea what I'd survived to get there. The judge asked for opening statements. Paolo stood, calm and deliberate, explaining how the property had been transferred without consent, how no legal documents authorized the sale. Clarice's lawyer tried to argue that it was for my safety, that I had been incapable of managing things. But they had no medical documents, no power of attorney, only excuses. When it was my turn, I stood slowly, holding onto the wooden rail, and began to speak. I told the court how I raised my daughter in that home, how I cooked meals for her every night, how I stayed up sewing her costumes for school plays. I told them how I had trusted her, how I had given her everything I had left, and how she had taken the only thing that was still mine. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I just told the truth, raw and simple. And in that silence that followed, I knew the judge had heard me. The final decision would take a few days, but the tension had shifted. I could feel it. Clarice avoided me as we left the courtroom. Her husband whispered something to her, but she brushed him off. Outside, Paolo turned to me and said, "That went better than expected." I didn't smile. Not yet. I couldn't celebrate until I was standing back in my house, until I touched the doorknob that was once mine. Back at the care home, Nilda was waiting. She had tea ready, like we were old warriors returning from battle. I sat beside her and finally let my shoulders drop. I didn't tell her the details. I didn't need to. She saw it in my face, in the way my hands stopped trembling. We drank in silence, two old women who had been forgotten, but not erased. I still didn't have the house back, but for the first time in a long time, I had hope. The next morning, Clarice called. Her voice was tight, clipped. She asked if I was trying to ruin her life. I answered with silence. Then she said something that struck me. "I thought you couldn't handle things anymore. I thought it was for the best." I told her that what she thought didn't matter anymore. What mattered was what I knew, and I knew she had lied. That conversation didn't end with tears or apologies, just a deadline and the hum of finality. Days passed. Then the letter came. I sat on my bed, hands trembling again, but this time from anticipation. I opened it slowly, eyes scanning the page. Judgment in favor of the plaintiff. Property deed to be returned. Further action pending. I read it twice, then a third time. I had won. I had actually won. My eyes welled up, but I didn't let the tears fall. I stood up, looked at Nilda, and said, "Let's go home." We didn't waste time. Paolo arranged everything quickly. The court order was clear. My house was to be returned immediately, pending a full investigation into how the fraudulent sale was pushed through. Clarice had been ordered to vacate the property within 72 hours. When Paolo told me that over the phone, I didn't feel triumph or satisfaction. I felt a strange emptiness, as if my heart had been holding its breath for too long. But that breath was about to be released. I was going home. Nilda helped me pack my things. There wasn't much. Some clothes, the notebook, a few books I had borrowed from the community shelf. She placed my sweater in the bag slowly, her eyes wet. I told her she could visit any time. She smiled, but I could see the loneliness creeping back into her shoulders. I reached into my purse and handed her an envelope. Inside was enough money for a lawyer consultation. I told her it was time to tell her story, too. She hugged me so tightly I could feel her ribs. Paolo picked me up early the next morning. He had brought flowers. White lilies, my favorite. The drive back to my old neighborhood felt surreal. Each familiar corner stirred a memory. The bakery where I used to buy Sunday bread. The park where Clarice fell off her bike and scraped her knee. The lampposts, the cracked sidewalk, the fading paint on the fences. It all looked exactly the same, and yet everything had changed. My fingers gripped the car door as we pulled up in front of the house. There it was, my house. But it didn't feel like mine yet. The windows were curtained with cheap blinds. The garden was overgrown, and the jasmine bush had been hacked down. A strange car was parked in the driveway. My chest tightened. Paolo glanced at me. "Are you ready?" I nodded. We walked up together, slow and firm. The door was answered by Clarice's husband. He looked like he hadn't slept. Behind him, Clarice appeared, her face pale. She didn't speak. Neither did I. Paolo handed them the court order. The husband read it, his jaw tightening. Clarice tried to say something. Maybe an apology, maybe another excuse. But I raised a hand. "Not now. Not here. You have 72 hours. Then I walked past them, into the hallway, into my past. The house smelled different. Not bad, just off. New paint, new furniture, but the bones were still mine. I walked through each room, touching the walls, the corners, the places where time had once stood still. My bedroom had been turned into a gym. My books were gone, my photos erased. I stood there for a long moment, then walked back to the kitchen. The table was new, but the scratches on the floor were still there. Marks from when I dragged chairs across it for birthday parties and Christmas dinners. I looked at Clarice one last time. Her eyes were red, but her lips were tight. She still didn't get it. She thought I was angry because of the house. She didn't understand it was about trust, about dignity. Back at the care home, I said goodbye to the staff. Some hugged me, others just nodded. A quiet acknowledgement of my victory. I hugged Nilda one last time and promised I'd come back for her. I meant it. She waved at me from the steps as I got into the car. The sun was high now, casting warm light through the windshield. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like a patient or a burden. I felt like myself again. That afternoon, I began restoring the house. Slowly, one room at a time. I moved out the exercise equipment and brought in a new mattress. I opened the windows wide, letting the air wash out the silence. I went to the nursery down the street and bought a new jasmine plant. It wasn't as big as the one I'd lost, but it was alive. Like me, I planted it by the front window. Its scent was still faint, but I could already imagine it blooming again. Neighbors started dropping by. Word had spread. Some offered casseroles. Others just wanted to hear what happened. I didn't tell them everything. Just enough. Enough to show them that I was still standing. Clarice didn't return after the 72 hours were up. She left a note folded under a magnet on the fridge. It said, "I hope someday you understand." I threw it away without reading the rest. I understood plenty already. Days turned into weeks. I cooked again. I walked through the house barefoot like I used to. I played old music on the radio and danced slowly in the living room. I found a photo of my husband tucked in the back of a drawer. Clarice must have missed it. I placed it on the mantel. He would have been proud. He always told me I had the strength of 10 women. I used to laugh at that. Not anymore. One morning, as I was watering the jasmine, I saw a young woman struggling with grocery bags across the street. I went over and helped her. She smiled and thanked me, asking if I had just moved in. I told her no. I had just come home. We talked for a while and she invited me for tea next week. It felt like the neighborhood was opening its arms again. Not because they pitied me, because they respected me. Later that week, Paolo came by with some papers. He had set up protections for the house, legal blocks that would ensure it could never be sold without my explicit permission again. I thanked him and asked if he ever missed being a lawyer full-time. He chuckled and said, "Not until you walked through my door. You gave me a case worth fighting for." We sat in the garden afterward, the sun warming our shoulders. I began writing again. Not just notes or plans, but pages, memories, lessons, a story. Mine. I wrote about the surgery, the betrayal, the fight, and the return. I wanted other women, mothers, grandmothers, widows, to know that they were never too old to be heard, never too weak to fight back. I sent the first few pages to a local paper. They printed it. Then another one called. Then a podcast. People wanted to hear what happened, and I was ready to tell it. Clarice didn't contact me again. Maybe she thought I'd forgive her in time. Maybe she thought I'd forget. But forgiveness doesn't come from forgetting. It comes from truth, and she never gave me that. So I moved on without her. It hurt, yes, but not more than staying silent would have. I had chosen myself. That was a wound that would heal, even if the scar remained. In the evenings, I sat on the porch, jasmine blooming nearby, and listened to the world breathe. Cars passed. Children laughed. Birds sang in the trees above. Life didn't stop because I was hurt, and I hadn't stopped living because I was old. There was still fire in me, still stories, still love. I didn't need to be anyone's mother to feel whole. I just needed to be me. That porch became my sanctuary. People came and went sharing their stories, asking for advice. Some cried, some laughed. All of them left lighter. I was no longer invisible. I was seen, heard, known. And every time I stepped inside my house, I smiled. Because this was more than a house. It was my proof that I mattered, that I fought, that I won. And there was still more to come. The seasons changed quickly that year. The summer heat softened into autumn's cool breath, and I began to notice how quiet the house truly was. Not lonely, just quiet. The kind of silence that feels earned. I filled it with the sound of music, the rhythm of old jazz records, the clinking of dishes as I cooked for myself again. Each movement felt sacred now, like I was reclaiming not just a place, but a piece of myself with every step. But as peace settled into my bones, the past came knocking once again. This time, not metaphorically. It started with a letter, handwritten, no return address, just my name and the street number, scribbled in a nervous hand. I opened it slowly, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of chamomile in hand. Inside a single page. "Mom, I'm sorry. I didn't know how to fix things. Please call me." It was signed simply Clarice. No explanations, no details, just the same vagueness she always used when she was trying to avoid responsibility. I stared at the paper for a long while, unsure what I felt. I didn't call her. Not that day. Not the next. I didn't owe her forgiveness on her timeline. But I carried the letter around with me for days, tucked into the folds of my cardigan pocket like a splinter I couldn't remove. I told myself I'd burned the bridge, that I was better off. And I was... But it's strange how love doesn't simply vanish, even when it should. A mother's heart is stubborn like that. Meanwhile, the story continued to spread. A journalist came by one afternoon to interview me. Young woman, bright eyes, asking all the right questions. She recorded our conversation and promised to send me the piece before publishing. I told her the truth, every piece of it, including the parts that hurt to say out loud. When she asked if I ever thought about reconciling with Clarice, I looked her straight in the eye and said, "I think about remembering who I am first. That's the only reconciliation I need." Days later, the article went viral online. The title was simple but powerful. She took back her house and her voice. I didn't expect the flood of letters, emails, and even calls that followed. Strangers from across the country shared their stories, some with tears, some with anger, some with hope. One woman said she left her nursing home after reading my story. Another said she confronted her son for years of emotional neglect. I didn't just reclaim a home. I had unknowingly started a movement. Then came the visit. I was sitting on the porch one late afternoon, shelling peas into a bowl, when a small car pulled up to the curb. Clarice stepped out slowly. Her clothes were neat but wrinkled. Her eyes swollen, not from tears that day, but from nights without sleep. She stood at the gate for a long time, unsure whether to open it. I didn't invite her in. I didn't rise to meet her. I just sat there, waiting. If she wanted to speak, she'd have to walk through it herself. She did. Step by hesitant step, she approached. When she finally stood in front of me, she didn't say anything. She just looked around at the porch, the jasmine blooming, the windows open with life inside. Her lips quivered. I waited. Then, finally she said, "I didn't think you'd survive the surgery. I thought I had to prepare for everything else." It came out shaky, uncertain. I said nothing. Clarice sat on the porch steps, not beside me. She looked at the ground as she spoke, said her husband convinced her it was the right thing, that the money could help them, that I wouldn't notice if they kept me comfortable. She admitted to forging the paperwork, to rushing the sale. She said she didn't realize how wrong it was until it was too late. I listened. But forgiveness is not a door you walk through because you say the right things. It's a road, one you build. I asked her one question. Why didn't you tell me? Her eyes filled again, but no tears fell. She said she was scared, that she didn't want to hear me say no, that she didn't want the guilt. I nodded, not because I agreed, but because I understood. Cowardice is often mistaken for protection. That day, I didn't offer her a hug. I didn't tell her I forgave her. But I did tell her she had to go. I needed more time. Maybe one day, but not yet. The days that followed were strange. People in the neighborhood who had once whispered about me now waved openly. Some brought small gifts. A pie, a scarf, a book. Others just sat with me for a chat. I had become something I never expected to be. A symbol. A reminder that even when the world tries to erase you, you can write your name back in. Paolo called me with more good news. A foundation had offered to help turn my story into a small documentary. They wanted to highlight elder rights, family betrayal, and legal education for the aging. I told him I'd think about it. It wasn't just my story anymore. It was every woman who had been made invisible. I wanted to tell it right. I visited Nilda the next weekend. Her room felt colder without me there, but her spirit hadn't dimmed. She hugged me like a sister and told me she'd contacted a lawyer. I smiled wide. She was finally taking the first step. I told her she could come stay with me once everything was resolved, that we'd sit on the porch together like old queens. She laughed, and for a moment we were young again. That night, I sat at my writing desk and started a new chapter in my notebook. Not for court, not for newspapers, just for me. I wrote about the way light looked on my jasmine plant, about the creak in the hallway floor that used to annoy me but now felt like home, about how it feels to be heard after years of silence. And I wrote about Clarice, not as a villain, not as a daughter, just as a woman who made a mistake and didn't know how to undo it. That's the thing about life. They tell you it gets quieter as you age, but they're wrong. It just starts speaking in a different voice. Softer, yes, but more honest, more fierce. I was listening now, to myself, to the world, to the parts of me that had been quiet for far too long. And for the first time, I knew the next chapter wouldn't be written in pain or revenge. It would be written in choice. I left Clarice's letter in my drawer, not torn, not forgotten. It would stay there until I was ready, until I wanted to answer. Not because she asked, but because I decided she had earned it. The ghost of the house she sold no longer haunted me. I had filled it with new memories, new stories, new breath. I wasn't waiting anymore. I was living. And there was still so much left to say. There's something sacred about early mornings in a house that's truly yours. The quiet isn't lonely, it's loyal. I woke up with the sun filtering through the curtains I had sewn myself. The smell of coffee drifting from the automatic pot I set each night. I stretched slowly, letting my joints speak before I stood. In this silence, I had become reacquainted with myself. Every step, every creak of the floor was like walking through memories I now owned again, fully and without shame. But even peace has its edges, and one of them still lived in the top drawer of my nightstand. The letter. Clarissa's letter. It had been sitting there for weeks now, folded, untouched, but never ignored. I could feel its presence every time I opened the drawer for a pen or a pair of glasses. It waited like a question I hadn't answered yet. I'd reread it once since that day on the porch, and still, it stirred something strange. Something between sorrow and defiance. There were days I thought about throwing it away. Others, I thought about writing back. But mostly, I just let it sit, like a bruise that still hadn't fully faded. The documentary crew arrived the following week. Just 2 young filmmakers, polite and focused, with soft voices and curious eyes. They wanted to capture my story, my words, my face, as I spoke the truth that had been buried too long. I agreed only because I knew it wasn't just about me anymore. I was just the door. What mattered was who could walk through after hearing what I had endured and overcome. So I welcomed them in, offered tea, and told them to start filming whenever they were ready. We filmed in the living room. I sat in my favorite armchair, framed by the window where sunlight poured in like an old friend. The camera didn't scare me. I had faced far worse. They asked about the surgery, the betrayal, the lawsuit. I spoke with clarity and calm. But when they asked about Clarisse, I hesitated. I chose my words carefully. "She's my daughter," I said, "and I love her." But love doesn't excuse betrayal. It just makes it harder to forget. Later, they asked to film around the house. I walked them through it room by room, sharing bits of history. That was the window where I used to watch Clarisse walk home from school. That crack in the tile? From the time she dropped a jar of preserves and cried like it was the end of the world. Every space held a memory. And yet, none of those memories softened what she had done. They just made it harder to let go. That evening after the crew left, I sat on the porch with a glass of wine. The sun was sinking low, and the air smelled like fallen leaves and jasmine. I thought about the years I had spent parenting, how I had given so much of myself to Clarisse. It wasn't about the house, it never really was. It was about what it represented. Roots, effort, safety, love, and how easily she'd swept it away in a moment of fear or greed or both. Paolo called me the next morning. He had been approached by a publisher interested in turning my story into a book. I laughed, genuinely surprised. He told me I already had the chapters. I just needed to connect them. I told him I'd think about it. I wasn't sure the world needed another tragedy to read. But maybe it needed a lesson. A truth wrapped in pages. Something that told older women they weren't invisible. And they weren't powerless. That idea stuck with me. A week later, I received another letter. This time, typed, formal. It was from Clarissa's lawyer. She was relinquishing any further claim to the house. She wanted nothing in return. The letter ended with a line that made my throat tighten. She asks only for your peace, if you're willing to offer it. I placed that second letter next to the first in the drawer. The 2 pieces of her, guilt and surrender, tucked away like puzzle pieces from a life I wasn't sure I wanted to complete. I didn't respond. Not yet. Instead, I focused on something new. I started attending meetings at the community center, support groups, creative writing circles, even a few local activism meetups. People recognized me. They thanked me. They asked questions, and I realized I had become something I never expected. A voice, a living, breathing story of resistance and resilience. And I intended to use it. One evening, while going through old photo albums in the attic, I found a picture of Clarisse as a baby, her cheeks full, eyes wide, fingers wrapped around my thumb. I sat down right there on the wooden floor, the dust swirling around me, and cried. Not because I missed her, but because I missed who we used to be, before expectations, before disappointments, before life got so tangled in unspoken hurts. It reminded me that our story didn't start in betrayal. It had started in love. The next day, I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I called her. She didn't answer, but I left a message. I told her I received her letters, that I was still angry, still hurt, but I was also still her mother. And sometimes, That means holding space for someone even when they've failed you. I didn't promise reconciliation. I didn't invite her over. I just spoke the truth, and that was enough. In the following weeks, she didn't respond, and that was fine. The silence didn't ache like it used to. I had filled it with purpose, with movement, with people who saw me. And one morning, as I opened the drawer to get a pen, I saw the letters still sitting there. I picked them up, walked out to the garden, and burned them in a small clay pot, not out of anger, but because I didn't need them anymore. The memory of what she did would never disappear, but the weight of it no longer needed to stay. That evening, I hosted a dinner for some women from the writing circle. We laughed, we shared stories. We filled the room with joy. The house was alive again, not with nostalgia, but with new beginnings. And as I cleared the dishes, humming an old tune under my breath, I realized something profound. I wasn't waiting for anything anymore. Not closure, not apologies, not even time. I had reclaimed more than my house. I had reclaimed my story. And that story wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. If someone had told me a year ago that my home would once again echo with laughter, I would have laughed in their face. Or maybe cried. But here I was, laying out mismatched plates across a long wooden dining table, steam rising from pots of stew, warm bread stacked in baskets, a candle flickering by the window. I had invited 7 women from the writing group, each one carrying her own battle scars, her own secrets, and her own stories. We didn't need permission to take up space anymore. We were claiming it, dish by dish, word by word. The doorbell rang right as I pulled the dessert from the oven. It was Marta, the first to arrive, holding a bottle of cheap wine like it was treasure. Behind her came Rosa with her famous lentil salad, and then Clara with 2 pies, already apologizing that one might be burnt. By the time everyone was inside, my house was glowing. The furniture was worn. The lights were a bit too warm, but the energy was rich, charged with something I hadn't felt in years. Belonging. We ate slowly, savoring every bite and every word. We talked about everything. The past, the future, the strange middle ground we all lived in now. At one point, Marta told a story about how her son forgot her birthday 3 years in a row. The table fell quiet. I reached out and touched her hand. "We've all been forgotten," I said. "But not tonight. Not here." Heads nodded. Someone wiped a tear. Someone else laughed too loudly. It was messy, beautiful, honest. At one point in the night, I stood up holding my glass of wine. I didn't plan to give a speech, but the words came anyway. I said that this house had once been taken from me. That for a while I had felt like I didn't exist anymore. That I had stopped recognizing the sound of my own name in other people's mouths. But that now, in that moment with those women, I felt more alive than I ever had. There was a pause after I spoke. A quiet kind of agreement. Then the clinking of glasses. Later that night, after the last dish was washed and the final hug exchanged, I sat alone at the table. The candles had burned down low, and the scent of cinnamon and roasted garlic still lingered in the air. I stared at the empty chairs, imagining each of those women in them, their voices still echoing in the room. I realized something important. My house wasn't a museum of pain anymore. It was a sanctuary of strength, and it would stay that way, no matter what came next. The next morning, as I was sweeping the floor, the phone rang. It was Clarice. Her voice was hesitant, thin like paper. She said she read the article, watched the video clips from the documentary. She said she hadn't realized the full extent of what she'd done, how deep the cut had gone. I listened. I didn't speak. Then she asked if she could come over. Just for coffee. No expectations. Just a conversation. I didn't answer right away. I told her I'd call her back. I made myself tea and sat by the jasmine plant outside. It was blooming stronger now, more vibrant than ever. I thought about everything. The letters, the silence, the betrayal, the fight, the victory. I thought about the women at my table the night before. And I thought about my daughter, who once had sticky fingers and pigtails, who used to fall asleep in my lap while I read to her from the same chair I was sitting in. The memories didn't excuse her, but they reminded me of who we both used to be. That afternoon, I called her back. I said yes. One coffee. One conversation. Not for closure. Not for healing. Just to see if we could sit at the same table again without bitterness leaking into every word. She agreed. She didn't sound relieved. She sounded scared. That was good. It meant she understood what was at stake. She arrived 2 days later. Alone this time. No husband, no mask. Just Clarice, a woman standing on the threshold of something she had almost destroyed. I opened the door, let her in, and gestured to the kitchen. I had already brewed a pot of coffee. We sat in silence for a while, sipping, not meeting each other's eyes. Then she spoke. She told me everything. About the debts. About the pressure. About how she felt like she was drowning. And how she convinced herself that selling the house was a solution, not a theft. She said she thought if she kept me comfortable, I wouldn't notice. That maybe I'd even be grateful. The words stung, but I didn't flinch. I let her keep going. And she did. She cried. Real tears, not the performative kind. When she was done, I didn't say, I forgive you. That would have been too easy. Too clean. Instead, I said thank you for telling me. That's all I had in me. That's all she deserved. For now. But I offered her a second cup of coffee. She took it. And we sat there again. Not as mother and daughter. Not yet. But as two women trying to decide if the wreckage was worth rebuilding. As the days passed, she came by again. This time, she brought photos. Old albums I thought were lost. Pictures of birthdays, holidays, garden parties, and quiet afternoons. We looked through them together. There were no grand apologies, no dramatic declarations. Just presence, just effort. That was enough. I started a new journal, not about the past, about the present. Each entry was a seed planted for tomorrow. A recipe I tried, a thought I had, a line from a book that made me pause. I began to fill the pages with color again, and Clarice, slowly, carefully, began to show up in those pages too. Not as a villain, not as a daughter returned, just as someone trying. I didn't tell anyone about our meetings. Not yet, not until I knew what they were. Maybe it would lead to something, maybe not. But I was no longer writing from a place of hurt. I was writing from a place of ownership. This house, this life, this story. They were mine, and I would decide how they unfolded. The jasmine outside bloomed wildly that week, as if the soil itself sensed the shift. I took a cutting and planted a second one by the back fence. It was symbolic, maybe, or maybe I just liked how it smelled. Either way, it rooted quickly, just like me. Just like something that had been nearly torn out but refused to stop growing. And though the dinner table still echoed with memories, now it held something else too. Possibility, not certainty, but the chance of something better, something real, something earned. There are 2 sets of keys that hang by the front door. One is mine, the original, worn smooth by years of use, the one that fits into the lock like a memory. The second is newer, recently made, still shiny. It belongs to Clarice. I gave it to her a week ago, not as a gift, not as forgiveness, but as an invitation. One that said, if you're coming back, come through the front. No more sneaking, no more secrets. You want to rebuild? Then start here where it all fell apart. She hasn't used it yet, and I'm in no rush for her to. The door doesn't have to open for something to begin. Sometimes, knowing the key is there is enough. It means she knows the door isn't locked forever. It means she knows I made a choice. One rooted in strength, not guilt. That distinction matters. Every day I see the hook where her key hangs. And every day I feel a little lighter. Because I control the locks now. I control the terms. In the weeks that followed our first coffee, Clarice continued to visit. Sometimes we talked. Sometimes we just sat. There were no rehearsed apologies. No tearful embraces. Just 2 women trying to navigate a road neither of them had ever expected to walk. She'd bring pastries or photos or little things from my old life she'd kept in boxes. One day she brought my sewing kit. Still organized, still smelling faintly of lavender. I ran my fingers over the thread spools and almost cried. I didn't tell her, but I started sewing again. Small things at first. Mending napkins, patching pillowcases. Then I made a table runner. Then curtains. It was like breathing through fabric. Each stitch a quiet act of reclaiming. I gave her one of the pillowcases she had helped ruin years ago. now repaired and embroidered with tiny jasmine flowers. She didn't say anything when I handed it to her. She just held it close, like something sacred. That was enough. At the community center, I had become something of a regular fixture. They invited me to speak at events now, not just to tell my story, but to help others tell theirs. I ran writing workshops for older women. Women who had been silenced by families, by systems, by the passing of time. I watched them bloom, slowly like I had. I watched them reclaim their voices. And I knew I had found my purpose. One afternoon I received a letter, this time not from Clarice. It was from Nilda. She had moved in with her niece across town. She wrote that my story had given her the courage to speak up, to demand better. She ended the letter with a line I'll never forget. You showed me it's never too late to come home, even if home is just yourself. I cried when I read it, not out of sadness, but out of something deeper, something like pride. The jasmine bushes had exploded with blossoms that season. I clipped small sprigs and left them on my neighbors' doorsteps. A quiet gift, a symbol. And every time someone knocked on my door to say thank you, I smiled and invited them in. My home had become more than walls and windows again. It was alive with warmth, with stories, with food and music, and the scent of tea steeping in the kitchen. It was mine. Clarice came over one Sunday with a photo album she'd rebuilt. She sat with me at the dining table, now polished and covered with the runner I had sewn, and flipped through the pages. Each photo was labeled in her neat handwriting. Birthdays, vacations, moments I had forgotten, or maybe moments I had forced myself to forget. She pointed to one photo of us in the garden, her hands covered in soil, my face beaming. You used to call me your sunflower, she said. I nodded. I remember. There was a moment of silence, thick and stretching. Then she said, I never stopped being your daughter. I just stopped knowing how to act like one. I met her eyes, and for the first time in a long time, I saw the little girl in her, the one who used to chase butterflies and beg for one more bedtime story. I reached across the table, placed my hand over hers, and whispered, Then maybe we just need to start over. Her fingers tightened around mine. Later that night, I sat on the porch with my journal in my lap. I didn't write anything for a long time. I just listened to the wind, to the hum of the neighborhood, to the soft creak of my rocking chair. When I finally did put pen to paper, I didn't write about pain or betrayal. I wrote about Jasmine, about keys, about second chances that weren't easy, but still possible. I think that's what people forget about healing. It's not a destination. It's not some polished moment where everything feels whole again. It's a garden. You plant a seed, you water it, and some days it wilts, some days it flourishes. But you keep tending. You keep showing up, even when it hurts, especially when it hurts. The sun dipped below the trees, casting golden light over the porch. I looked at the second set of keys, still hanging there, untouched. Then I looked at the pillow Clarice had left behind earlier that afternoon, the one she asked me to sew a patch onto. It had her childhood initials, stitched crookedly in the corner. I traced the thread with my fingers. This house had once been the stage for heartbreak. Now it was the setting for rebirth. My story didn't end with the betrayal. It didn't even end with the court victory. It kept going. It keeps going. And as long as I have breath, and hands to write and flowers to plant, it always will. Because I am not the woman who lost her house anymore. I am the woman who got it back and turned it into something even stronger. If you've made it this far, thank you for staying with me through every twist, tear, and triumph. This story wasn't just about a house. It was about dignity, resilience, and the power of reclaiming your voice at any age. I hope it reminded you that healing is messy, but it's always possible. Now I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below, letting me know you reached the end. Just type I made it home so I know you're part of this journey too. And if this story moved you in any way, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss another powerful story like this one. Your support means the world.